an external expert today. His name is Sean Blair, and I'm just going to introduce him briefly, and then he'll take over. So Sean has over 25 years experience of leading and supporting organizations to innovate, learn, and change, and particularly in the realm of facilitation. He runs a company called ProMeet, and they offer meeting facilitation and facilitation training, which we're all lucky to receive today. So welcome, Sean. I'm just going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's lovely to be here with you all. So thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to come along and participate. Let's just begin by talking about our objective in the next hour. We've tried to design this session with the following objective in mind: to give you an understanding of the value of facilitation and to provide you with some very practical tools and instructions for things that you can do to improve your meetings right away. So the way that I'm going to try to pass on some tools to you is with a set of 6 or 7 objectives that we have for the next hour. And the first is to try to provide you with a compelling case about the value of facilitation and why it's the main tool of a participative leader. So here's a question for you. Do any of you honestly wake up in the morning and say to yourself, what I really want today is a meeting? I think there are very few people that actually ever wake up in the morning and say to themselves, what I really want today is a meeting. The truth is, nobody wakes up and wants a meeting. What people really want is what happens because of meetings. What you and others want is not meetings, but they want outcomes, things to happen because of that. And in my world, as somebody who spends his life running meetings, I find that I get a lot of people call me and say, hey, Sean, can you facilitate a strategy meeting? And I always respond by sort of saying, well, I can, but that's not really what you want. You probably don't want a meeting, you probably want an outcome. And here are 4 really great questions that I always ask at the beginning of any assignment that I take on. And hopefully these 4 questions will be useful for you too. The first is, by the end of the work, what would be the best outcome that you would hope for? And it's interesting to think about using the word work rather than meeting, because oftentimes meetings are in service of bigger things like projects. So at the end of the work, what would be the best outcome you would hope for? And oftentimes people haven't thought fully about the outcomes that they actually do want. The second question that I ask is, let's imagine that the work has been wildly successful. What will have changed for the better? And this question helps me understand what somebody's change objective is. Often, meetings are in some way, shape or form in service of trying to help some form of change. And this question specifically gets to the nub of what people are trying to change. The third question is, let's suppose that we look at this work as a step in a larger initiative. What's the ultimate goal? That helps me understand the bigger piece that people are actually trying to achieve. And then finally, is there anything else that you'd like to achieve in meetings? And I find that these 4 questions are a really great way of trying to get to the nub of what people are actually trying to achieve. So I will often say to people, you don't actually want a meeting. What you really want is some outcomes, some ideas, some solved problems, some change, some better relationships, some trust. You want something else. So it's very helpful at the beginning of thinking about a meeting to not think about designing a meeting, but to help think about creating a set of outcomes. Let's think briefly about different kinds of leadership styles. So here are 3 pictures. You can match up the words to the pictures. Clearly the person on the left might be a picture to represent an authoritarian leader. The person in the middle could be seen as being a paternalistic leader. And the person on the right could be seen as being a democratic leader. My proposition is that a really effective leadership style for complex modern organizations is what I call a participative leadership style. And this is a photograph of a client that I recently worked with. So here's a quick definition of what I call the participatory leadership paradigm. It's based on respect and engagement to constructively focus energy in every human-to-human encounter, every time people meet. It as being an advanced, democratic and effective model of leadership, one that actually harnesses diversity. Diversity is often not welcome in meetings. One that helps build community and to create shared responsibility for action. Because it deepens individual and collective learning, yielding real development and growth. And it's a fantastic leadership paradigm for creating change. So my proposition is that we modern leaders need to think of ourselves as being participatory leaders, to try to get the very best out of all of the people that come and gather and meet to try to work together. And so you can think of facilitation as being almost the primary tool of the participatory leader. So if you find yourself sitting in meetings where you see things a bit like these rather depressing black and white photos, you can probably be fairly assured it's not a participative leader that is leading that meeting. Because participative meetings look and feel a bit like this. And these are, I'm going to show you half a dozen slides of photographs that have been taken in a variety of the types of meetings, conferences and workshops that I've facilitated. So you can see people being lively and active. You'll see people being objective driven with a clear process. In this case, also, they were using a process called Lego Serious Play, something we don't have time to talk about today. Participative leadership makes meetings feel active, makes people feel involved. You don't tend to see people sort of yawning a lot in participative meetings. In actual fact, when I'm trying to design a meeting, I will probably try and design the energy in a meeting to make sure that people are not doing one single task for, let's say, more than 20 or 30 minutes. So often there's quite a lot of movement in well-designed meetings. And you'll see people working together in small groups or in big groups, or sometimes people working alone or in pairs. People smiling, being creative, being active, being thoughtful, being involved. So looking at what's happening in a meeting is a really good sign, I think, of what kind of leadership is available for you. And I'm not going to do any more than this slide than just highlight it for you, because I thought to myself, the best way I can make a compelling case for the value of facilitation is not in my words, but in the words of people who I work with. So under this 30 recommendations, there are 30 different people talking about how they have experienced participative meetings. And there are a very large number, I think 24 case studies that you can look at to get inspiration for your own meetings. This slide deck will be shared with you after this meeting, so you can access all of those links. So I've given you a little bit of the sort of the theory, and that was probably a bit boring, so apologies if you found that a bit dull, because we're now going to get into some slightly more practical stuff. I'm going to try and give you some tools, some of the key tools that I use to facilitate the kinds of meetings where you see people enjoying themselves, as you just did in the previous slides. So the second objective in this webinar is to emphasize the importance of a participatory worldview and offer you 4 other principles for meeting excellence. So I'm going to show you what I call the meeting excellence model. And the first principle in the meeting excellence model is the idea that meetings should be participative. And I'll just sort of skip back to the slide that I brushed over very quickly. This is an idea that I came across about 10 years ago about how the Western worldview had evolved in the last 2,500 years. The idea being that a worldview is that tacit set of assumptions and beliefs about how we construct our reality, how we see the world. And had we lived 2,500 years ago, we would have lived in a time of mythos, and we would have constructed our reality through the idea of the Greek gods. And then, of course, Plato and Socrates rock up, and the Greek god worldview gave way to Logos, a different and more rational view of how the cosmos worked. And then about 2,000 years ago, this worldview called Theos was created, the Judeo-Christian perspective. And many people constructed their reality through the idea of God, an omnipresent God. And then about 400 or 500 years ago, the mechanistic, mechanos worldview evolved and made amazing things for us like iPhones and computers, but also created a lot of difficult things like environmental destruction and social breakdown. So the idea is that these different worldviews have been around for about the last 2,000 years. And for those academics who study such things, they believe we are moving towards a participatory worldview. Now, that's a bit of sort of academic theory, if you like. But the reason I tell you that is because participation needs to be a very deeply held value of the person who's running the meeting. And if you stop and think about it, oftentimes in meetings, participation actually is not welcome. People are not invited to say what they really think, or if somebody is upset or angry. Oftentimes those forms of participation are not welcome. So for me, as a designer of meetings, I try to use the participatory idea as a very core idea about how I design meetings. And you can think of that as being a very deeply held value for you as a facilitator. I'll quickly go through 4 other principles. The second principle of effective meetings or excellent meetings is that they're purposeful, that meetings have a clear and compelling overarching intention, not something that you NDP will struggle with because your work is very meaningful. But maybe sometimes agenda-driven meetings don't have very clear and specific meeting objectives. And oftentimes they don't have the focus to be able to achieve those common objectives. The third principle is that good meetings have a well thought through and well designed process to enable people to achieve the objectives and get results, a process designed to maximize energy and participation, and a process designed to harness diversity. Excellent meetings create visibility, aligned energy, collective wisdom, and as we'll see a little later in this webinar, the idea of clear action and clear learning. And if you remember the black and white photograph that I showed you earlier, I don't think you would have seen that as being a very healthy meeting culture. But I think that excellent meetings are healthy, and they actually create authentic human respect done well. They can also help create real learning. And why can't meetings actually be a driver of creating energetic and vibrant cultures? So these are 5 principles of excellent meetings that I use as I go about designing my own meetings. We've done a little bit of work, but only so far 2 people have responded to this question about sharing views on meeting agony and ecstasy. So if any of you have had any further thoughts.
People have replied on the question boxes as well. So you have.
Now, where do I see?
You have something called question.
I've got a question, but I can't see anything in there.
Yeah, I can't see that either, Elodie. I think only you can see it.
I can read it.
You want to share what it said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have when there is no real dialogues in the meetings, when they go off topic, when colleagues are not concise, when it appears to be a waste of time, when someone dominates, when there is no structure. And that's it.
Brilliant. So no real dialogue, off topic, when people are not concise, when somebody dominates. And what was the final one? No structure.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who've offered these thoughts, some of the tools that I'm about to share with you can really, really help with some of these things that we often experience. So let me press on. So I'd like to introduce you to this idea that successful meetings have 4 phases. That's an interesting question for you just to think about. As you prepare and plan for your own meetings, do you think there is a set of steps or a set of sequences? These are the 4 phases that I use every time I facilitate a meeting. The first phase, and it's probably the most important, is the objective stage. And that is to define the objectives you wish to achieve in the meeting. Somebody who said when things go off topic, I often think things go off topic because the objectives are not clear. And in ProMeet world, in my world, we never ever use agendas. So an agenda, which is a list of subjects that we're going to talk about with a list of timing, we banish agendas. We never ever use agendas. Instead, we convert every single agenda item into an objective. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more and sharing with you a method card about how you can think about setting your own objectives for your own meetings. The second phase of an effective meeting is the idea that you will design a process. Design a process to allow the right people to participate in creating success in the right way. And actually, if you've done the objectives phase properly and done it well, because clear objectives use clear and active verbs, the verb in an objective will help define the process. I shall show you some examples of this shortly. The third phase of effective meetings is to clarify what will happen because of it. If it's a 1 hour meeting with just a couple of people, what's going to happen because of that 1 hour meeting with a couple of people? Or if it's 200 people meeting for all day, what are the actions that will result as a function of having spent time working together? And the fourth phase of effective meetings is to invest a little bit of time in learning. Particularly in environments where you're asking people, where change is important, where you're asking people to change. The time spent in a room working with each other is an amazing opportunity to learn about yourself, about how you think, about your values, about how you act, as well as learning about your subject and the interpersonal dynamics between a team. So these are the 4 phases of effective meetings. And hopefully you will have noticed in this webinar, which is more of a broadcast than a meeting, we've tried to use objectives at every stage of the webinar. We have a process to try to achieve those objectives, and then before we conclude, we'll talk about actions and learning. So I would suggest to you that a well thought through meeting will go through all 4 of those phases. Occasionally, it may not be appropriate to do a piece of learning. Occasionally, there may be a reason to not go directly to action planning, but mostly there is. Certainly, the objectives and process phases are absolutely vital. So let's talk a little bit more about the importance of objective setting. For me, I find that it's something as a consultant, I spend a lot of my time at the beginning of client relationships, helping clients do, because oftentimes people just are not very clear about the objectives that they wish to achieve. So, establishing clear meeting objectives, in my opinion, is one of the key aspects of designing and facilitating effective meetings, because the objectives will determine everything. A good, clear set of objectives will keep people on topic. It will, well, I'm going to show you a tool in a while which will help people be concise and not dominate. Clear objectives, in a way, provide the structure by which people can communicate with each other. And here is what I call a method card. This is a method card to help people write good, clear objectives. And if you look at this method card, what you will see on the bottom left is what I call the anatomy of a good objective. So a well-written objective will begin with a clear verb, to agree. So if you are going to have a meeting objective which is to agree, that means you will need to facilitate some agreement processes. If the verb was to create, you would then need to have some creation processes. If the verb was to plan, you would need some planning processes. If, however, you didn't have an objective and you just had a subject, let's say the subject was toilet paper, I'll just make that up. Some people might want to plan a toilet paper strategy. Some people might want to create. Some people might want to agree. And the problem is that people don't align how they engage with the topic if you don't have a clear verb. So in the anatomy of a good objective, the first thing you do is you work out what is the verb. The second point is to clarify the subject, and if possible, to determine what the relevant outcome is. And on this method card, you will see a set of good verbs. And I'm just for your information, I always think that some weak verbs are things like discuss, to talk, to catch up, to ponder. The problem of these types of verbs is they don't help people have clear conversations on what needs to happen to the subject. If your verb is to talk, that's what will happen. People will just talk from one of many, many different perspectives. The only other thing I'll say on this method card for now is that oftentimes it's useful to think about an objectives logic. How can you connect the specific set of meeting objectives to the greater, more strategic objectives of an organization? And I find that that can be a very helpful thing to do. You can download this method card using the link at the bottom. And why don't you take it, and for a meeting that you've got coming up, look at your agenda, if you've drafted one, and see whether you can convert every agenda item into a clear objective. Let's move now to reviewing briefly how objectives might translate into a meeting or workshop plan. Now, for me, the process of planning a meeting or workshop can be generally an iterative process. If it's a short and simple meeting with not too many people and not too high a sort of risk level, it could just be a very simple sort of set of iteration. I recently facilitated a very important meeting for about 320 people, and we probably went through 6 or 7 different iterations of the plan to ensure that the objectives were right and to ensure that we had a process that would allow us to achieve the objectives and get everyone in. So the planning, I think, is a very iterative process, and I've given to Lisa a Word document, which is a template for what I call my facilitation notes. And if you look at this next slide, in fact, what you will see is a page of my facilitation notes for today's meeting, although it's more of a broadcast. So you'll see that what I've done is I've thought about the overarching objective of this webinar, which is to give participants an understanding of the value of facilitation and to provide some tools and instructions for facilitation techniques. And then what I've done is I've broken that down into a set of timing issues. The second column gives me a sense of what each session might be called, how long I'm going to spend, what each session is called, what my objective in that session is, and then what my process will be. This is a fairly simple set of facilitation notes because in a way this is a fairly simple meeting. It's more of just a sort of a broadcast. So this is not a particularly long or complicated document. But maybe what I would encourage you to do is once you've received the facilitation notes from Lisa, is see whether you can use this template to plan your own meeting that's coming up. I have many, many, many of these. Whoops. Sorry, just dropped something. So just grabbing from my box up here, here are sort of sets of facilitation notes for various previous meetings that I facilitated. This is an interesting one. Overarching objectives, strategic objectives, and then it turns out to be, in this case, it's a 19-page set of facilitation notes. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of that. And if any of you are particularly interested, I could be happy to pull out some further examples for you to look at. Let's move to our next objective, and this one will particularly help those of you who experience people being dominant, or for those of you who sometimes think that people aren't very concise. I use what I think is an incredibly simple and powerful tool. And our objective for the next part of this webinar is to understand what I call the mighty power of the humble grid card. Now, grid card is a funny word. It's a word that I made up. And what I mean by grid card is it's just a simple A6 piece of paper. It's slightly thicker than photocopy paper in order that it's a bit more robust, but it's just a simple piece of paper. I have 4 types of grid cards. One grid card for each of the 4 stages of effective meetings. So the red one is an objectives grid card. The orange one is a process grid card. The yellow one is an actions grid card. And the green one is a learning grid card. And grid cards will do a lot of things for you. I'm not proposing to read all the words on the next slides, but I did want you to have a copy. So the first thing that grid cards can do is they can help democratize. If you use this simple device and ask everybody to write down what they think, and I always give people fat pens because you can only get about 20 words on a small piece of paper with a fat pen, it makes sure that everybody in the meeting can express their opinion. So grid cards can democratize. This is an amazingly powerful device for saving time. Those people who like the sound of their own voice and talk forever, if you use a grid card and say to people, for the next part of the process, we're going to identify the key thing that you think is wrong with this particular issue, and you ask everybody to write down what they think. You can also use what I call the one grid card rule. That means you ask people to only read out the words that are written on the card. And it takes 15 seconds to read 20 words. So grid cards used thoughtfully can actually save an awful lot of time. The third thing they do is they help diversify. Oftentimes in meetings, we're not very good at hearing divergent views. People will norm and follow each other's views. But if you ask everybody to jot down what they think, it helps get really, really diverse perspectives. And I often find that when people will write down a diverse view, the fact that they're reading it from a card somehow takes some of the emotion away from it. It becomes a slightly more objective point. Grid cards help unify and focus, to help everyone think about the same thing at the same time. There are 5 other things I think grid cards do. They create a record, and I shall show you a set of typical outputs from a grid card-based meeting. So they make a written record of all of the important things that were said and done. Somebody said people sort of dominate or are not concise. Often people will drone meetings, and that can be incredibly draining. If you break up the tempo of a meeting and get people to be active, including, jotting something down, that will help increase energy. They can also help connect diverse ideas, and you will have seen on the photographs that I showed you earlier, if I put them up on the wall as we go through the meeting, they help show progress. In fact, let me just quickly remind you of some of the pictures that I showed you earlier. Having now been introduced to the grid card, you can see them in many of the meetings that I facilitate. In fact, this picture here with objectives and process probably makes more sense to you now. This was a workshop for the Intercontinental Hotel Group. You'll see on the left-hand side a set of clear objectives for the meeting, and those objectives broken down into a process, and the process occasionally had everybody jotting something down on a card. The bottom left photo, you can see people just about filling in some yellow grid cards, because at that stage of the workshop they're doing some action planning. This was a workshop for the World Animal Protection Charity, and again you can sort of see grid cards being used in a variety of different ways there. This was a workshop for a large Japanese automotive parts manufacturer. Again, you can see the wall chart in the background, particularly on the bottom left slide, seeing the progress as the meeting progresses. This was a workshop for 80 head teachers. Again, you can see people working together both on flip charts and on grid cards. So I'm a massive fan of this incredibly simple device. Sometimes I facilitate using Lego. That may have to be a subject for a future webinar. We don't have time to talk about Lego today, unfortunately, but it's an amazing tool. So I just wanted to introduce you to what I think is the mighty power of the humble grid card. It's an incredibly simple device. But I use them so often. This was a workshop that I facilitated actually in Vancouver 2 weeks ago. And there's the written output of everything that was said. In fact, you can also see sometimes I pre-print them. I don't always do that, but sometimes I do. So here's the written output from this particular meeting. And what I've done is I've put a link here to a blog post about how to use this particular process. And you can download the artwork for these cards individually or together, or you can just use Post-it notes or A4 paper torn up. I do think small cards and fat pens are better than big cards and thin pens. Big cards and thin pens tend to give people permission to do that very long-winded thing again, which is one of the things we're trying to cut down on. Okay, where are we on the clock? We've got about 20 minutes to go. So let me crack on to Objective 8. Now, agreement is a really interesting thing in meetings. I don't know how you have experienced agreement in your own meetings, but it's one of the areas that I find as a professional facilitator, people really struggle with. Let me paint a quick picture for you. I sat on the board of a particular organization, and the classic agreement process there was the chairman would introduce the subject. Some people would discuss the subject from any particular perspective. And then the chairman would say, so here's the decision, are we all in agreement then? And he would nod, and a couple of other people sitting around the table would also sort of nod. Some people would just sort of sit there and say nothing. And occasionally somebody may say, no, I'm not sure I do agree with that. Which is an agreement process you might recognize, and it's an incredibly ineffective way of actually getting agreement. Because, of course, people may not agree. Being passive and being quiet is not a sign of agreement. So let me introduce you to an incredibly simple but very powerful method called the scales of agreement. So again, here's another method card. The scales of agreement is a very simple tool to operate. What you would do is you would say, we have something that we need to agree. Let's say there's a proposal. The proposal is that we will do X, Y, and Z. Does everybody understand the proposal? Once everybody understood the proposal, you could say to people, take a card, a grid card, decide where you are on the scale of agreement. From I fully agree, I've got no questions, concerns, or reservations, down to I disagree, or I block, or I abstain. Probably most people will agree or have some questions, in which case you also ask them to write down their key question, concern, or reservation. So it takes about 1 minute to clarify the proposal. Give everybody a card, clarify the scales of agreement. You don't have to use these particular 8. You can simplify it and make it 3 or 4 or 5 scales. And then ask everybody to decide where they are on the scale and to record in writing their key question, concern, or reservation. Then I would typically ask everybody to stand up and to place their card on a floor, let's say, where I will put some big cards with full agreement all the way down to block on the floor. And of course, that idea of getting everyone to stand up helps increase the energy. It helps people wake up. Movement is good in meetings. And this is an incredibly useful tool. checking the level of agreement for proposals and decisions with a smaller group as 2 or 3 or 4, or even 200 or 300 people can operate this process in parallel. In fact, one of the photographs that I showed to you earlier, you might now recognize on the bottom right. This was using the scales of agreement in a workshop of about 40 people. They had a particular, very important proposal they needed to consider. And we did exactly as I've told you. We introduced the proposal. We took some questions for clarification. We asked everybody to decide where they were in the scale of agreement. We put a printout of the agreement cards on a set of steps on the way to lunch, as it happened. And we asked people to place their cards on the relevant part of the scale of agreement. The whole process took 5 minutes. And you've also captured and recorded all of the key questions and concerns. It's a brilliant and very simple tool, which I would strongly suggest you all try. You can download the assets from my website, from the blog. I haven't put a link in there, but you'll find them on the blog. They're at the bottom of the blog. Was there somebody about to ask a question? I heard a bit of it.
It was me, it's Lisa here. Hi. I just wanted to highlight for everyone that this particular method, I mean, they're all really helpful, but this one in particular for national commodity platforms could be extremely useful because the plenary meetings are a kind of consensus building forum, and you can have anywhere between 60 and 200 people in those meetings. And they're not really meant to make agreements or decisions, but they are there to say, at what level do we support, certain actions that need to be done to make this commodity sustainable? So as a tool to use to get a kind of testing, how are our stakeholders feeling about the progress or the direction that we're going or what's being presented, this could be super helpful. So I just wanted to flag that for context.
Yeah, it's a brilliant tool. It was invented by a lovely guy called Sam Kainer, who wrote a book called The Participatory Guide to Decision Making. It's an amazing book for facilitators. I wish I could say I'd invented it. I didn't. It's a tool that was invented by a very clever man called Sam Kainer. Excellent tool. I strongly suggest you use it. Our final objective before we do some sort of learning and questions ourselves is this, and that's to briefly understand or touch on the last 2 phases of meetings, action planning and learning. Did anybody talk about no real decisions? I think somebody mentioned that earlier. Or no clarity about what happens as a result of meetings. Typically, what I will do at the end of all of the meetings that I facilitate is I'll put in some time on my facilitation notes for a piece of action planning. And typically, I will give people some yellow grid cards, and I will say to them, well, we've had whatever discussion, whatever work we've done today. So now what actions will happen as a result of our meeting today? Sometimes I might even structure that slightly more clearly. So I might say to people, let's say we've done a piece of work on strategy. I might say to all of the participants, I'd like you now to write 5 grid cards for 5 actions that you will take in the next 90 days to help implement this strategy. I might give people 3 or 4 minutes working quietly alone, and then I will probably ask people to stand up and come to the front of the room, or maybe to the wall chart. You've seen me sticking things on walls in some of the photos. And I'll have them read out their actions using the 1 grid card rule. It doesn't take very long. And that process helps build accountability. So there are lots of different ways of using the action grid card, as many as that you can imagine, but it is incredibly helpful, I think, to clarify what actions will happen as a result of having spent a bit of time meeting. The 4th phase of effective meetings, which I've said earlier that I think the objectives phase is probably the most important. It's certainly the area where I think that most people don't focus well enough on. But in projects and meetings that are involving change, this phase, the 4th phase, the learning phase, can be an incredibly powerful phase, particularly if people have spent a lot of time working with each other, or if it's been difficult or emotional or challenging in any ways. So again, what I might do at the end of the meeting, depending upon how long it is, if it was an 8-hour meeting, I might preserve the last half an hour for a piece of learning. And oftentimes I would introduce people to this idea of triple loop learning. I might say to people, single loop learning is what can you learn about your actions today? The double loop learning is what can you learn about how you've thought today? And the triple loop is what can you learn about the values and also the consequences that you've seen with others. There's a lot of other learning lenses that you can use, but it's great as a participative leader to ask people, well, what have you learned as a result of this meeting? It may be that this triple loop lens is the wrong lens entirely, and you might just wish to reflect upon what you've learned about us as a team, or what we've learned about the subject that we've been working on. And done well, people will do this with vulnerability. And if you finish a meeting where people will have a learning circle and share some of the learnings that they've taken from the meeting, I find that that's really where change can happen and where trust can be really built. So we've got about less than 10 minutes before the end of this webinar. And I would just love to pose a question to you about, for those of you who've been sitting in front of your computers very politely for the last 50 minutes, what has been your key learning in the last 50 minutes? I imagine that you might use the question box that I can't see. If you've got the message box, I might be able to see that. So why don't all of you, I think we've got about 9 participants or 10 participants on the call, take a moment and think about what has been your key learning in the last 50 minutes. And why don't you jot an answer? You could also tweet it to ProMeetings if you're on Twitter, or email it. That's another option. And then we might read a few of those out. I've just about done, I think. There was one other thing I wanted to show you, and that is this idea of creating outputs and records from meetings. So what I'm going to do is quickly open this link. So I talked earlier about the utility of grid cards. Let me just bring up a browser. This is often what I will do with the outputs of meetings. So this was a meeting that Lisa and I were involved with for a part of the Triple GI. And what you'll see here, if you scan down, let's make it slightly smaller, that this is the outputs of this particular meeting. There were 40 people, roughly, working for a day. And the outputs were captured in a set of working group draft plans. Note the use of grid cards. We captured a video of the chief executive doing his main presentation. And this is the bit I particularly wanted to show you. Here are all of the grid cards from this particular meeting. So this is the written record that I mentioned earlier. We started this particular thing with people sharing their hopes for the workshop. And then we used the Scales of Agreement tool on a particular decision and captured what people thought. The end of the day one learning grid cards. And then day 2, I won't read them to you. But I just wanted to show you this web resource because it's an example of how these fantastically powerful tools can be used. That's about it, really. So we've got a few more minutes for any questions, if anybody would like to ask anything. Or I don't know whether we want to take audio. I don't know whether you do that on these calls. Lisa, can I ask you just to quickly jump in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. I just want to check with LOD if there's been any responses to what people have learned in the last 50 minutes.
Yes, there has been. Do you want me to read it?
Can you post them to the chat window?
I have to copy and paste them all, but
oh, don't worry. If that's easy, then
yeah. So no need to capture every point of everyone in a meeting. Rather, make everyone focus on key questions, suggestion. Check the agenda and concentrate on the objectives. Have clear objective and desired outcome before entering meeting. Invest time in preparation for the meeting. Processes to reach agreement, very rarely seen. Seems like such an important step to create true participatory outcomes. The importance of keeping energy levels up and empowering participants. A tool to increase the energy in a meeting without being awkward. And the learning phase, very rarely done, usually done via questionnaires after, but seems more inclusive to do on site in a participatory manner.
Oh, lovely. Lovely insights. And, I think that I've mentioned this briefly. I think one of the other things that I do as a professional meeting designer and facilitator is to take as much attention about the energy of a meeting, to be able to design the sort of the flow of people. As I said earlier, it's very rare, I think, in one of my meetings to be doing any one task, let's say where people are going to be sitting on on a chair for an hour. That's just not going to happen. Human beings do not work well in that environment. So something as simple as a little grid card task where people sort of stand up and share ideas in pairs or threes and have brief discussions. I think that one of the reasons that some of the meetings that I run look a little bit like this is because people are active. They're sort of fully active and fully involved, both sort of intellectually but also sort of physically. I think that could be a useful point to just emphasize.
Great. So thank you very much, Sean, for dedicating the time to share all of this. Thank you to everybody who has logged in and listened and learned from this webinar. In terms of follow-up, I will send out, Elodie or I, early next week, will send out a note so that you can have a link to the slides. We'll have a recording of the webinar, and I'll also just summarize all the tools that Sean shared and put links to them in the same email so that you just have the resources in one place for the future. And feel free to reach out to you, Sean, people, if they can they get in touch with you directly?
Yes, absolutely. My Twitter is @ProMeetings. My email is sean@promeet.co.uk. So if you have any specific questions that you'd like me to fire some answers back on, I'd be very happy to do that.
Okay, wonderful. Great, thank you. I wish everybody either a good evening or a good rest of the day, depending on where you are in the world. Bye.